And I still think there is an unrealised potential in Kambalda. They've always had this famous, where is the vent, where does the nickel come from?
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on stage. I'll just introduce you a little bit more detail. I won't go through biographies. I'm sure most people know who these gentlemen are. To my right, Edmund Ainscough, Managing Director, Executive Chair? No, Managing Director of Lunnon, of Lunnon Metals, the Kambalda Explorer, Foster Baker nickel resource. Although, you're looking a little bit of an imposter here, given the share price in the last couple of days on the back of your gold hits in the space. And then thank you for joining us, Ed. Next to me on my left is Oliver Kiddie, Managing Director of Legend Mining, and definitely not Executive Chairman because he sat over there. Of course, with the Rockford project, nickel project on the Fraser Range, and some... It looks like you're back on the ground. Some EM survey results and targets coming through. Ollie, thanks for joining us. And then Caedmon Marriott, Managing Director of Western Mines Group. We have made the mistake in the past of calling you Western Mining Corporation. That was a big promotion for you, Caedmon. Who, of course, you have the Mulga Tank project that everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with. And again, some great results this morning. I'm glad you could time it to coincide with this event. James, thanks for joining us. I've got a few questions here. It is an interactive session, so please, if you've got a question, comment, whatever you like, please raise your hand, and my colleagues will be wandering around the room with some microphones. So we've got plenty of time. We can dig deep into this nickel exploration sector. I think I might start with you, Oliver, if that's okay. I'm going to put on my hard-hitting journalist hat straight away and ask you...
Sounds intimidating.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, we just heard from Andrew that, the sentiment in the market isn't great, but also the fact of the matter is, in the Australian context, the West Australian context, the home of Australian nickel, we haven't seen really a discovery, an economic, developable discovery since Nova, which is now more than a decade ago. I mean, why haven't we seen something? Is there a reason for that?
Nobody's found it. that's the simple answer. But I think your point about sentiments, is right on the money, and why we're here today in this format. It's very much about sentiment, and from an exploration point of view, it's all about sentiment, because if you're looking to raise capital, it's very difficult at the moment to raise capital for nickel exploration. But in terms of discovery, and Nova specifically, that's the one that stands out over the last decade. We should be looking to find more Novas. You just look at the financials, that tells the equation, really. IGO in their last quarter, we're producing nickel at $2.94 a pound, selling into north of $11, nearly $12 a pound. So there's clearly really good margin in that from an economic standpoint, and that's with 2.5 years just under to go at Nova. So that's not in its heyday. So I think it points to we should be looking for more of these. And, in terms of price, I did a bit of research on this with respect to when Nova went into production. It was October 2016, and the nickel price was $9,918. What are we today? Nearly $18,000. So it's not price, it's sentiment.
Ed, would you agree with that? We were just talking earlier on. You've pivoted from nickel, what looked like an incredibly promising nickel discovery and resource growth in Kambalda. You've pivoted to gold. Is that because of the sentiment in the market that you felt you couldn't retain the momentum to take that project forward?
Well, Dom, a couple of things. We obviously did make a discovery, Baker. You said there hadn't been one since Nova, but it's obviously not the size of Nova, but Baker is 33,000 nickel tonnes at over 3%, sitting in the top 300 metres in Kambalda, in the middle of the WMC 100-metre drill spacing. So you can still find these things if you're looking. And there may be a bit of a qualification on the pivot. We had actually finished pretty well all of the drilling we needed to do at Foster and Baker, so it was a pretty easy decision not to do any more there. And certainly in respect to our Silver Lake Fisher project, that was expensive deep drilling. So in this market, with the sentiment, notwithstanding we think it's a fantastic opportunity at Silver Lake Fisher, I just didn't think we would get rewarded. In fact, the feedback from either the broking community or the shareholders was, please don't drill those holes. So it's not really a pivot. It was kind of a full stop and then turn our mind back to the gold potential. But without a doubt, with that sentiment being so negative, and I think I've stood up at this conference previously in Fremantle. In fact, I stood up in Fremantle the day that BHP announced they were shutting the whole business, which was a difficult gig when all I had was nickel slides. It's definitely made the point, it is sentiment. It's nothing wrong with the nickel price. And Ian Junk's on our table. I think Ian will, he's been involved in nickel in Kambalda district for longer than anyone I know. And he would tell you this is a good price. Baker makes good money at this price. There's just nowhere to put it currently.
Caedmon, you're earlier stage than Lunnon are. On a project that's been looked at before, are you finding it challenging to maintain momentum, and how do you address that?
Well, definitely, yeah. I mean, I was just going to actually answer your question on Nova. I mean, why isn't another one we found? Because it's hard, right? There's people having a lunch in Toronto asking the same question about Voisey's Bay, and that's 30 years. Because there's huge amounts of factors that are going to come to play to find deposits like that. And yeah, to answer our question, we think we do have something quite special. We have a whole greenstone belt just 2 hours out of Kalgoorlie, but undercover. You've got to go to new areas to find these things. But nearly everywhere we drill, we're at least going to find a very large, low-grade, disseminated nickel sulfide deposit. But we think there's a good chance of finding high-grade within that. But going back to how hard it is to find these things, even something, I forget how big Nova is, but the surface footprint of Perseverance is only like 650 metres by 200 metres. So you're really looking for needles in haystacks, but inherently very, very valuable projects, right? So that's the excitement around it. But,
and it is difficult, but there's been a lot of advances in exploration technology over the last, and techniques over the last decade. Do you feel like Western Mines, personally or particularly, and in a wider space, are we getting closer to using that technology in order to make that breakthrough?
I think definitely. Undercover, we've got to bring the full suite of geophysics to bear, right? So we've got everything, airborne mag, gravity, the guys at NameCheck, the expert geophysics guys at the back there. We flew mobile MT, looking for a larger terminated system, looking for conductive targets within a large dunite. But yeah, the other side of that is you're going to get a lot of false positives, right? In all these types of systems, you're going to find your black shales or your conductive things that are going to offer false positives. But, there's probably no silver bullet. Yeah, there's been advances, but if there was a silver bullet in exploration, then everyone would be using it, right? But, you've got to put it all together as a package. You've got to have confidence in your ground, and you've got to, stick to your task and keep going.
Ollie, I see you nodding your head there. It's obviously you've taken up that challenge on the Fraser Range. After the Nova discovery, there was 20 companies running around the Fraser Range exploring for the next Nova Bollinger. You're one of the survivors out there. What have you learned in that period about nickel exploration in that belt?
It's very much perseverance, and I think that goes for any nickel belt. And it's, as we've touched on, there's no silver bullet to nickel exploration. It's using all tools at your disposal. Where we are, we're the Northern Fraser Range, we're dealing with on average 50 metres of conductive cover. So your surface EM is rendered difficult to, ineffective in places. Outside of that, it's not just a matter of just drilling holes and flying airborne EM, and I think that's where you saw the massive companies in the Fraser Range early doors, flying airborne EM, getting conductors, drilling them. If it was that simple, as we've touched on, nickel would be 50 cents a pound. It's just not that simple. So we've applied new science and cutting-edge science like seismic. So we're of the belief that it's of the fact that it's expensive to drill a hole in the Fraser Range. If we're drilling down to plus 700 metres, 800 metres, it's going to cost us $350,000, $400,000. So you want to make sure you've got that hole in the right spot. We've seen a shift in the physical cost of things like seismic, where once you would only dream of doing it. When I was working for Mark Creasy, we looked at doing some single 2D lines at plus $1 million for a 2D line. Now we've completed 2 3D surveys at Legend on known fertile intrusions, and the second one at Octagonal was just under $1.1 million for a plus 24 square kilometre 3D survey. So there's been this astronomical shift in the cost component, and if you relate that back to physical drilling, that's 2-3 drill holes. So there's no excuse why you shouldn't be applying this science.
And is that bringing you closer? Do you feel closer now to making that breakthrough discovery than you've been at any point in the company's time?
For the first time, you're getting a look in that Z component at architecture, and that's, everybody knows there's, we're looking for intrusion, and it's, what does that intrusion look like at depth? And the seismic allows us to give us the architecture. And you're not just drilling blind at an EM plate or just blind below an EM noise floor. You're drilling into an architectural concept based on some hard data, which is seismic. So that's coupled with your geochemistry, coupled with your EM, your other geophysical techniques. All of a sudden, you're starting to rank your targets accordingly.
Thanks, Ollie. Ed, obviously in Kambalda, it's a slightly different situation. It's been drilled, it's been mined, it's been developed right through that system. But as you mentioned, you were able to come up with a new discovery. Is there still more there to be discovered? How does a belt like that continue to bring up discoveries like this?
Look, Ollie just mentioned seismic. We did seismic at Silver Lake Fisher, where we have the nickel rights, we don't have the tenements. That black block of ground is about 6 square kilometres. We made big play that there's not a single drill hole, and it sits next to the original Silver Lake mine, which was the original discovery in Kambalda, 123,000 nickel tonnes, directly south of Mincor, now Wailu's long operation, order of magnitude 300,000 nickel tonnes. So it's a pretty good address. And then to answer your question about discovery, the ground obviously has to be permissive. Like if the nickel's not there, if you don't have the endowment, which is, the WMG guys doing great work out there. I'm a small shareholder, keep going. Love it. But it's very hard because they are deep holes. And when we did seismic, again, it was, as Ollie said, it's a lot cheaper at Silver Lake. We probably spent about $1 million. When I talked about that area to shareholders, I said it's the easiest way to explain the prospectivity is it would be harder to explain why there's no nickel there than why there's nickel there. So the question really isn't in a place like Kambalda whether there's any nickel. It's can I find it efficiently and cheaply enough, especially in a negative sentiment market. Because they're deep holes, they're expensive holes. We were order of magnitude spending $1 million to drill a parent hole and a wedge off that hole. And the geology was fascinating. The first drill holes in this area, and we hit a 50-metre wide structure, had gold in it. Unfortunately, we didn't have the gold rights to that project, which was a real shame. But that just shows when you drill the first hole in a brand new area, you can hit anything. And surely that's the excitement. But I think Kambalda also is quite a salutary lesson. If you look at what WMC did back in the 60s, after they found Lunnon, Silver Lake, they drilled a series of deep diamond hole traverses called basically nickel traverse lines. And they're about, I think, an imperial mile apart, maybe got down to half a mile apart. And within a few years, they had literally unlocked the geology, the structure, where that nickel was underneath the lake, on the south side of the lake at Foster Jan, and then again at Lanfranchi. So they found all that nickel in very short order. But turn your mind, could you do that now? Even as a company the size of WMC, I don't think you could. So we're 2-3 generations away from that. So it's much, much harder to do that, even as a big company, let alone as a junior company.
That's an interesting point you make, Ed. Ollie, I'll come back to you. You mentioned, a lot of companies went on into the Fraser Range after the discovery of Nova, and obviously IGO eventually ended up taking Sirius, but even they weren't a huge company at the time. Is nickel exploration lacking some big company firepower and expertise to push forward a new wave of discovery?
I'm not sure whether it's lacking the firepower. The support is always good. I think if you look at the discoveries, Nova being the perfect example, it was made by Mark Bennett and a very, very small team. You look at what we've discovered at Legend, it's obviously not the next Nova, but it's under 50 metres of cover, very conductive cover at that, and zero surface expression. And if you looked at those drill holes twice, most geos would walk away from it, but there's 1.5 million tonne resource there. I think regardless of commodity, the bulk of discoveries are still made by juniors. It's a matter of funding, and that's fundamentally what we talked about at the top, that it's currently sentiment which is the issue, and every drill hole that you put in, like Ed was saying, it's very hard to get that money back at the moment.
Does that make it tough then to open up new search spaces? You know, we've seen very few new nickel frontiers in the last decade, really. Obviously, BHP, or West Musgraves was discovered and half developed and moved on, and then it's paused again. Is that lack of sentiment even struggling to open up new frontiers?
Oh, definitely. It obviously offsets that slightly if you've got multi-commodity. So if you're in the Kambalda belt where you've got gold in association with nickel in close proximity, obviously then you can pivot, and also multi-purpose drill holes. So there's a treasure trove of data from other drill holes completed for other commodities, not just exclusively nickel.
Yeah. Caedmon, you have the same at Mulga Tank. Obviously, there's copper values in that nickel drilling, or that drilling that you've been doing. Does that allow you to sort of generate some sort of momentum in the story?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting some surprising copper hits. I think we're always going to be a very nickel-dominated system, though. But I guess stepping back to your original question about the larger companies, I mean, as we understand, you know, guys like BHP, you know, from conversations with them, their global generative exploration budget is probably currently 80% copper, 20% nickel. You know, they're still looking, and things like their Explore program, yeah, it's very much copper-dominated, but new nickel spaces, yeah, they are still very much a watching brief for them. But I guess to the point, you know, nobody's charging into nickel at the moment, so whether you're a big company or a little company. So,
well, we heard Andrew mention that the joint venture with the Japanese conglomerates, Mitsubishi and Sumitomo. Have you, you said you've spoken to BHP in their global exploration team. Have you fielded interest from outside of Australia and outside of those traditional mining houses in what you're doing?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, all the Japanese, all the Koreans, yeah, any of that. If you can, I think that's probably unique to something that we're looking for. I mean, worst case scenario, if we just have a very large, low-grade nickel system of maybe 5 million tons of contained nickel and sulfide and a large, you know, kind of quasi-porphyry, if you want to call it that. Not that it is, but that's the analogy you make to someone, you know, retail investor, and make liking it to copper. But yeah, these are assets that can produce 40,000 tons a year of nickel for, you know, 40, 50 years type thing. And so that's the sort of thing that very much excites, you know, those sorts of large companies. They can, you know, you look at something like Nova with a 10-year mine life. How many nickel cycles did Nova capture? I mean, one, maybe two. But if you put a, you know, 50-year mine life out there, and as long as you're making high teens IRR, it's washing its face. And then you've got a series of these nickel spikes during that time. You know, these types of assets print, you know, more money in 2 or 3 years than, you know, than they certainly pay themselves back very quickly. So, yeah, you know, we've maybe got something unique for Australia. There's a few Canadians, Canada Nickel and guys like that are sort of maybe 3 years ahead of us, full feasibility study, 10x the market cap. But, you know, we think our project's better on every means, which kind of, you know, gives us the confidence to keep going. But, yeah, to directly answer your question, yeah, all those large corporates are interested in looking at something like that, yeah. And
for Legend, Ollie, are you seeing international interest from groups that perhaps, you know, traditionally we wouldn't expect to be shown an interest in a company of your stage of development?
We have done over the previous years leading up to this latest downturn, for sure. It's people scrambling to get exposure to that next big nickel discovery, and you need to be on the frontier where Legend are. We're out Fraser Range, Proterozoic belt, akin to the Thompson, Voisey's Bay, etc. So I think we've seen BHP in the last week or so. There's been some noise around switching to maybe put the spotlight back on Kabanga, and I think that's more talking to the quality of the asset, which is Kabanga, than anything else. It's a 2.6% nickel ore body plus 50 million tonnes within 150 metres of surface. So it's grade is king, and obviously size to boot. That'll turn anybody's head.
Yeah. Ed, the guys are talking about projects that are, you know, sort of different from the traditional Kambalda operation. For many years at this conference, we had people like David Moore saying, yeah, we'll continue mining, and this is the level we've got to this year, and this is where we'll be next year. And sure enough, he came back and said exactly that. Is that the sort of story you're trying to build at Foster Baker, that traditional Kambalda high-grade underground mine, and is there still a space for that in the market?
Look, I think there is. I think listening to Ivan Vella at the Mining Club, talking about their nickel strategy and how they needed to be a lot more selective and targeted to be able to compete, say, with the Indonesians. I mean, there's two ways to compete on cost. One is grade, and the other one is to get your unit cost down. So Kambalda's always going to be a bit challenged in terms of its operating cost because of the style of the deposits and the amount of capital that's required to get from level to level. But it can certainly compete on grade. But I mean, historically, the strength of Kambalda was obviously that WMC held all those assets. And, as you know, myself and Ian and a lot of the people within our company and that we know within the network have talked in some respects almost romantically about the days when the nickel price would be down in the past, back in WMC days. Melbourne would ring up Kambalda and want more Kambalda ore, because that was their ability to respond to difficult times at their other assets. Remembering that when they built that business, they found Kambalda, they built the concentrator, then the refinery, and then only then the smelter. And they ran that business for the best part of 20-odd years before they even added Leinster and Mount Keith. So very much grade, having all those assets together, it was essentially a classic case of 2 + 2 really does equal 6 in Kambalda. Now that they're all disparately owned, obviously then begs the question about collaboration in the Kambalda region and the absence of BHP and what their intentions are pre-February 2027. So obviously in that circumstance where the asset base is fragmented between different ownership, the higher grade the better. We like to think Baker will be a key part of however the cards fall in Kambalda. That kind of grade, that kind of metal with that cheap capital access cost has to be a part of whatever pans out. But Foster Baker, their Kambalda assets, great grade, can be difficult to mine in troughs that keep on keeping on.
Did BHP's decision and the clarity around it, is it sort of given you a boost? Is it kicked you along, or has it kicked you in the guts?
Well, like I said, that day I stood up in Fremantle was a difficult presentation. In some respects, having the doubt removed, because you could kind of feel that there was this orbiting, pervading sense of dread in regard to the nickel tsunami, the headwinds that happened. We were kind of the last stock to get really smashed. We actually stood up quite well, but then the whirlpool just sent it in on Kambalda. Wyloo obviously made the sensible decision to terminate their operations, and BHP announced they were shutting down, and then we got smacked. So we were kind of the last to get hit, and we're probably the last to get off our knees, and we've done that based on the gold. So it was good to get it out, and then we've very much got an attitude internally now to no more rearview mirror. There's no point looking back at what the share price was or how much we were worth. We very much have to look forward and navigate moving forward. You cannot base, even in a small company, or strategy on what a very large company is going to do, remembering that BHP and RGO didn't see it coming. So if they didn't see it coming, you'd have to take with a pinch of salt their forecast about when it's going to pan out again and work itself out. I'm a bit of a cynic, as people will tell you.
Thanks, Ed. I want to change tack slightly. We talked about big company interest, and that might help a kick along the other place. And I say this having noticed that the ministers and senior policy advisor just walked in the room. The other place that could be of some help is government funding and government support. Ollie, let's get stuck into this straight away. I mean, is there more state and federal governments can be doing to encourage nickel exploration? We've seen it added to the critical minerals list. We've seen the production tax credit for those who are operating in ambitions to be a downstream operator. But what about upstream? What about at that exploration stage? Is there more to be done?
Absolutely, and that's not exclusive to nickel. You can start with getting access to the ground with native title to begin with. It's become a lot more difficult in recent years, and if you're going to make the next discoveries, you've got to do them in a timely fashion. And we're dealing with wait times now that are turning into months and if not years to get access to ground. Now you're going to miss complete cycles if that continues to play out. So absolutely, the government can start at ground zero with respect to things like ground access. There's some phenomenal work being done. Obviously, Geoscience Australia cover most of Australia and the new frontier regions with new data sets all the time, and those data sets are freely available, and we should be utilising those, and the good explorers in the room here are absolutely utilising those data sets. But access to tenure is still primarily function 101.
Kevin, would you agree with that sentiment? Are you having to battle your way through a permitting system?
Yes, I mean, obviously, yeah, we suffer all the same as that. We're actually very close to Ollie in terms of the same native title groups and all that sort of stuff. I think stepping back on a sort of macro level, I think that help is coming. I've told this story before to people about, I was at this awesome boat party at IMARC last year in Sydney Harbour, talking to the guy from the US that runs their IRA funds. And the guy's got $10 billion to invest in critical metals. And, it was kind of, well, how do I get that money and what do you want for it? Is it equity? It's grants. We'll give you the money and we'll write it off after 3 years. How do I qualify? Just get yourself a letter from Elon saying that your concentrate qualifies for the US supply chain, give you as much as you want. And if you want debt finance, he had $100 billion of that. And so, there's very much you've got to pick your side now, and we very much would go the blue team route. You need to be IRA compliant. I think Western sulfide assets become increasingly significant in that. And then on the same boat, I met the person running the Australian equivalent fund, who also said they had $10 billion, which I obviously misheard to be 10 million, because I thought the Australians would never be that organised. And they love nickel sulfide as well. But it was, tell me you've got nickel sulfide, but don't mention the word exploration. Because as soon as it's exploration, that's gambling with taxpayers' money, right? So they can't give you a cent of it. But I think once you get up, if you can prove up a project and it can be a significant scale, and you get up to that level, I think the money will be there to develop a lot of these projects. I think the US, the guy said himself, we're 20 years behind China. The only way to get out of it is to spend our way out of this. And they've got the money there and they're mobilized. And yeah, it'll take them time to deploy it, and we need to sort of catch up with that. But macro government help, I think there's a broad theme of that for sure. And then, yes, of course, the day-to-day of permitting and all that could all help as well. But I think there's a rising wave of support coming.
Ed, you were involved in those discussions around the production tax? You were in the meeting, the nickel crisis meeting at the start of the year?
Various meetings, yeah.
Yeah, what was your feeling coming out of those meetings? Did you feel that nickel exploration was a sort of a topic of discussion, or is it like Caedmon is saying that it feels too risky for government to get involved with?
My takeaway from those various meetings that hit the media in February was there was strong empathy and sympathy, understanding the impact on jobs. I think the federal and state reps that came to the meetings understood that was real, that people were going to lose their jobs. I actually asked a question of one of the attendees. I don't think they had any real understanding of the impact on the equity market sentiments. They just did not see the link between the decisions that were being made by the operators to how that flowed through. And I think it was in the West Australian that someone said nickel is uninvestable. It was actually a quote, which I repeated that quote. And they were shocked. They kind of hadn't really foreseen that flow-through impact, that bow wave of these decisions in early 2024, and what that might mean for the time and the fuse it would take then to find the next suite of nickel or copper or whatever assets. So I definitely think there's a part to play with state and federal. I mean, obviously, something like the EIS program, you could have a separate program that specifically targets critical minerals. But I think there's a lot of optics, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of people talking about energy transition, and they're doing it because they're talking to particularly an electorate that they're targeting. But when push comes to shove, you've got to see the actual action. So if they're serious about it, they've got to try and help fund junior companies that can't tap the equity markets by maybe providing some government grants for that kind of high risk, very expensive exploration.
Thanks. I've done enough work for a little bit. I'm just going to have a rest, and I'll ask somebody in the audience to take it up for me, please. Have we got any questions? Hopefully our microphones are roving at the back of the room. Angelique's there. Oh, we've got one straight away, right down the front, please, just to your left-hand side.
Thank you. Yeah, it's all live. Caedmon, it's a question for you. Sort of the elephant in the room here is Indonesian nickel. And I know you were visiting up there earlier this year. And I'm really interested to hear your takeaways from that in terms of what the relevance of what you saw up there is to the sentiment about nickel here in Australia.
Yeah, no, great question, Mark. Obviously, we're both there together. Yeah, that was very much a fact-finding mission for us. And yeah, it was a good 3 days, wasn't it? Just to sit in the audience and let it all sort of wash over and try and absorb as much as possible. And I came back very positive, and I had 5 points that I wrote up a memo to the board, and I can't remember all of them right now that you've put me on the spot. But the main thing was, nickel's never going below $15,000 ever again, I think was my main takeaway. There was very transparent. There was Chinese producers putting up presentations with kiln projects, cash cost $15,000 US, and that's from a Chinese company, pretty transparent. All the great work that Jim Lennon does at Macquarie and things like that with his presentation, showing cash cost curves, and something like 50%, again, doesn't make money at 15,000. So the world has changed very rapidly. Indonesia's grown, but a large block of that, 30-40% of it, probably doesn't make money below 15,000. So that's a huge top end of the cash cost curve that you've got to eat into. So there's headroom there for us. So I came back positive, because if we think we've got a project that can work in that, then it becomes almost like the Pilbara, that if we can produce nickel at something like Canada Nickel can, then we can just keep exploring. Other takeaways was one on the grade. Hey, they were 3 years ago, anecdotally, the grade was 1.8%. Now it's hard to find 1.6, and it's mostly 1.5. If they build out their capacity, there was the government thinks they've only got a 6-year mine life. Like, they were shit scared of it. And there was all kind of, we're going to have a moratorium on any new build because we've only got 6 years left. Of course, that's at a certain cut-off, and you drop the cut-off, and you get exponentially more reserves and resources. But the cost is just going up the whole time. If you're going from 1.6 down to 1.2s, 3s, then again, the cost is just going up. What were some of the other ones? Have you got any comments, Mark? Have you got that's probably it for me for now.
From the macro side of things, I was fortunate enough to head up to Indonesia in November 22 and actually have a look at Morowali and Sulawesi firsthand, just to see what, as a guest of Nickel Industries, to see what they've done up there as part of that industrial park. And as a MD of a nickel sulfide explorer, it's apples and oranges. It absolutely is, but it's more the macro takeaway for me was what can Australia be doing from a governmental level? When you see what Indonesia have done from on board with industry and from a governmental level, from 2014, the raw export ban, to where they are in 22 with 3,500 hectares expanding to 4,200 hectares, wall-to-wall RKF lines, bolted-in stainless steel plants, all this backed by government money in one direction, like the China One Road policy. To the point about the Pilbara, I really don't see why we couldn't do something similar in the Pilbara. We've got all the raw resources and infrastructure and ability to have the further infrastructure. It was a real wake-up call.
Thanks, Oliver. Thank you, Mark, for the question. I think it's probably one we're going to pursue even further in the next panel. Did we have any other questions? We obviously haven't been pouring enough wine and beer yet. There's one just over here.
Thanks very much. 2 general questions. Firstly, are we exploring in the right places? I like the concept of Mulga Tank. Are we on diminishing returns, needle and haystack in the mature search spaces? When you look at the recent major discoveries, Nova, West Musgraves, etc., have there been out there locations? So that's the first question. Second question is, to what extent has the iron ore industry and the rampant significant price gains there bred poor cost management, which has caused difficulties for the rest of the mining industry in Western Australia?
Ed, did you want to take the search bit? Or you can take either question.
I'll take the search space one. Look, I think you're right. When you look at a typical Kambalda asset, wearing my Kambalda hat, there is a point of diminishing returns when you're chasing those troughs down deep. The tonnes and metal per vertical metre obviously can become challenging. But the search-based concept, leveraging off John Hronsky, I mentioned the Silver Lake Fisher area, the 6 square kilometres. He and the team at Minkor Wailuit have done some amazing work looking at what might be in that area of the dome. So there's different concepts. I think you can still be in a very mature field like Kambalda if the area literally hasn't been tested. I do think anything's possible, and you do benefit obviously from that rich endowment that, as I said earlier, the ground is permissive. And I still think there is an unrealised potential in Kambalda. They've always had this famous, where is the vent, where does the nickel come from? And that still hasn't been answered. And I think Wailuit and Minkor and John and the people who work with the smart guys at those two companies have kind of made the first baby steps towards looking at that. And we've tried to do something similar with the seismic at Silver Lake, but we just got handcuffed by the sentiment and the lack of support to go and spend that kind of money.
Does the success that Goldfields have had in finding Invincible, does that say there's something particular about, I'm speaking as a non-geologist here, particular about the Kambalda field, or the Kambalda district that says that you can make these discoveries many years after?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're in a super endowed belt, obviously anything is possible. And I remember Roy Woodall visiting back in the WMC days in Kambalda, and he famously said, look, just give serendipity a chance. You don't be too cute, actually drill the holes. And if you look back, and I was the ex-chief geologist at St Ives, so any gold we find now is a bit embarrassing, but I'll take it. WMC actually drilled Invincible. Peter Buick, for those who know, Peter drilled with the hover rig, late target 17, hit gold, but we just had operational issues and we had to get that rig on the lake back to where we needed it. And it lay fallow there until Goldfields drilled it out. But absolutely, order of magnitude, they're talking 10 million ounces, like the biggest thing ever found in Kambalda on the gold front, and it was found last. So I think if you're in a highly endowed, permissive belt, yeah, absolutely, you've got a ticket in the lottery.
I suppose, Ollie, going to Matt's question, when you're looking in new search spaces like the Fraser, it still is. You can't rely upon that received wisdom. You've got to try and break through that paradigm and come up with new theories and new ideas.
Yeah, very much so. And as Ed said, the search space concept, obviously John Hronsky's behind that, and he has another very good saying around the biggest discoveries are made where there's the least data. So you're forced into these frontiers undercover where angels would fear to tread, decades ago. But to your point about controlling costs, that comes wherever you are, and it's about spending. First of all, identifying your search space and then identifying your target. There's no point drilling at 1,000 metres if you're not looking to delineate a huge ore body. Spending the money correctly. If you look at the footprint of Nova Bollinger, it wasn't detected in airborne EM. Well, in fact it was, but it was a category 3 anomaly, and all of us in the room that have worked throughout Kambalda and other nickel districts, when you conduct airborne EM, how many thousands and thousands of level 3 conductors do you get? You wouldn't pick it out of the haystack. So you've got to apply more than just spending shareholders' dollars on geophysics alone and praying and wishing. You've got to apply some genuine science.
Caedmon, is it the same at Mulgatang? It strikes me that we've had nickel exploration in this state for nearly 60 years now, and there's a lot of assumptions and preconceived ideas about what Ollie's point about Nova. What a nickel discovery will look like in its early days. Do you find yourself coming across those objections?
I think so, probably, yes. On the concept of search spaces, maybe we are doing something new. We're undercover, ticking that box. We're out in the Burtville terrain. Has there been many nickel discoveries out there, sitting right next to a very large structure? And you made the point before that this project's been worked on before, and yes, Mike Jones at Impact did some awesome work 2013-14 and drilled 8 holes, 6 of which had nickel sulfide in. But before that, probably, Ben was actually involved in a Australian-wide, what's it called, nickel search project for WMC in 2004-ish. And back then, there was only 1 hole in Mulgatang, and it wasn't even in their database. Like, they hadn't even heard of it in 2004. And so there was by the time Mike drilled it, was probably 3 holes in there. He put 8 in. You know, we put a heap more in, but you know, it's unlocking new search spaces undercover is certainly what we think we're doing. We think we've got some good ground, and you know, we'll keep going on that.
Thanks. Matt, I see they all studiously avoided a question about iron ore pushing up costs. We might even save that for the next panel with some of the producers and developers. Do we have any other questions? I'm sure we do.
Thank you. The comment that Oliver made earlier about the margins on Nova, even on its final legs, do you think outside this room, government, investors, hedge funds understand those huge margins on magmatic nickel, as well as magmatic nickel being multi-commodity as well with copper and cobalt? Do you think if more people understood how big a benefit a discovery like a new Nova could be, that could help shift the sentiment in terms of nickel exploration? Because gold producers could probably only dream about the margins that Nova produce, even now in its last couple of years, not what it would be back in its heyday, and margins probably even rivaling BHP in the iron ore space. Do you think if more people understood how big a project that could be, it could change sentiment in the market?
Ollie, did you want to take that one first?
He's one of mine, so I better take this question.
Exactly,
Look, absolutely, it'd be beneficial if government knew more, but how much they can actually absorb is another part of the equation. You know, then it comes back to the funding side of it. From the company perspective, it's up to us as a company to convince investors to dip into their pocket to back what we're looking to do and explore for the next Nova in our case. And we need to compete against, in our case, the 2 guys either side of me. So, and every other company out there, be it gold space or nickel or any other commodity. Obviously, if the more up the curve government were, absolutely, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
What about markets? You know, we talked about Nova being discovered at a time, developed at a time when the nickel price was in a very tough environment, but it was very quickly identified as a genuine discovery, world-class discovery, and it was able to defy any market sentiment or trends. Would that happen today if you were to drill a hole tomorrow at Caedmon and come up with a huge discovery that shows that it's going to be economic very early? Do you think you'd be able to ride out any sentiment that we currently have in the market?
Yeah, I reckon. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about these types of deposits. I mean, you made the polymetallic nature of them. They're very, very concentrated, very high value deposits per ton, and so that's the excitement. You find one of these, and that's like a Nova, and that's why you can sell it for $2 billion in 18, 24 months type thing. I think even in the current environment, I mean, to the exact point, do people know about it in the market? No, probably not. In good times, everyone can be looking for the next Nova, and it doesn't matter who you are. As long as you've got some ground, you can find the money, and the market probably doesn't differentiate between good ground, poor ground, good teams, poor teams. But then you find even in now, you know, if you're in a trough, you're just in a trough, and it doesn't matter how close you are to finding a Nova, people, you know, don't really care. If the sentiment's not there, if the price isn't going up, then
until you find it.
Yeah, until you find it. Yeah, until you prove people wrong.
Finding it changes the equation, and you've seen IGO under the new management with Ivan Vella, and Ivan's been on record saying he'd very happily take another Nova discovery. You just have to look at their financials for the full year for FY24. 51% of their EBITDA came from Nova, and they own Greenbushes, so he'd take another Nova any day of the week.
I think the investment community very much understands the margins at a Nova, without a doubt. But I'll quote Mark Bennett, and I'll point out Mark Bennett was underground in gold in Cambodia back in '94 with me. Just get the gold back in there. He said to me once at a conference that he will just be a failure until he's a success. So unfortunately, until the sentiment turns, it doesn't matter what you do until you've actually found it, exactly as Caedmon said. So yeah, it's difficult, but they definitely understand that, you know, if you found an Nova, it's a good thing, that, you know, people understand how much money it makes.
And I suppose it's in a way it's a wider malaise with the exploration sector, isn't it, as well? I mean, we've seen, you know, we've had over 2 years of rampant gold prices, and it's perhaps only in the last couple of months, if at all, the gold explorers are sort of starting to catch a wave of enthusiasm?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a bit commodity agnostic at the bottom, without a doubt. And I'm good friends, and the other company that came out of the private effort that we had that bore Lunnon Metals, Medallion Metals, down in Ravensthorpe, have been toiling away for ages in terms of that development space and drilling. So it isn't just nickel specific. I mean, nickel just got clobbered because all of a sudden it was in the newspaper every single day for 3 or 4 weeks. But yeah, there's definitely a risk off at that junior end, without a doubt.
Ollie, we see juniors. Ed told me off for saying pivot. He said it was a full stop, and they were moving to gold anyway. But we see juniors usually pivot between commodities. You guys have sort of stuck the course, searching for those on that Fraser Ranges. Have you had that debate internally, and how did you settle on no, this is where we need to be?
I think any good governance company always has robust debate around these topics. Obviously, Legend's in a unique situation, or we were in a unique situation. When I came on board at Legend in August 2020, we had over 3,000 square k's, so that's a very large land holding for a junior exploration company. So it's very difficult to have multi-commodity, multi-projects when you've got such a high holding cost. But as we've reduced our footprint through turning over the ground, we've kept what's prospective and what we are still continuing to explore and drop the rest. You naturally look at opportunities, and one of the most attractive things from a Legend perspective outside of our people and our enviable register is our cash. So north of 13 million in cash makes us in a pretty enviable position from a junior explorer perspective. So in this time on the to quote the Lion Group clock, I think it's 4 a.m. So it's M&A central, and the tree's getting shaken, and there's some opportunities popping out of this. So short answer is yes, we look at other opportunities. Yeah.
Great, thanks. We must have another question now.
Thank you. I'm looking at it from a free enterprise viewpoint, and I'm always amazed at people asking how much money the government going to put into this or that or everything else. And I had a very interesting discussion with Matt earlier. I'd like to get your opinion on what do you think the real role of government should be in the mining industry, especially in the nickel industry?
Yeah, look, I'll kind of reference back to those meetings we had at the start of the year, and I think one of the other panellists mentioned just what the Indonesian government had done in terms of kind of stumping up and having the back of those early investment money. Don't forget, for example, the Pilbara and Cambodia with the nickel industry, the WA government back in the 60s, took a very similar approach. We built an industry out of nothing that's lasted 3 generations, and that was through government support. Specifically in Cambodia, the Refinery Act agreement that granted WMC lots of latitude in terms of the tenement and the spending and the royalty regime, and a similar thing was done up in the Pilbara. So certainly back in the 50s and 60s, I would have thought the WA government very much had a kind of a nation-building mentality. And have we lost that somewhat? Are we sitting here with very much a free enterprise that business has to pay its way, forgetting just what actually government did help to build this state in the past? And we criticise the Indonesian government, but really they're just doing what our government did 60 years ago to build a nickel industry out of nothing. So I think government does have its part to play, but it is a cycle. And again, I had a previous person I worked with, is sometimes you need to break down to break through. And maybe things do need to completely break down before government reassesses its position.
Great, thanks. Great question, thank you. Again, it's another one we could probably pursue in a little bit more detail in the next panel. Caedmon, I want to ask you, you mentioned before talking, you said you were in some cruise in the Sydney Harbour. It sounds quite nice, but it got me thinking about, we talked about market sentiment and the attitude of investors here on the ASX. It got me thinking about other international markets, and you mentioned Canada Nickel a couple of times. Have you had discussions with your peers in North America and elsewhere? Are they having the same existential crisis when it comes to nickel that we have?
I haven't. No, I don't have any comments on that. No, really, other than obviously we do follow a lot of those Canadian ones that are more similar to us. And yeah, Canada Nickel, I think Anglo American originally put in 25 million US, maybe 24 months ago. Samsung at the beginning of the year put in 18 million US, and Agnico Eagle just put in 35. So there's big people writing big checks for these things, and there's not just them. There's FPX Nickel, and there's several others as well that they're attracting $10, $20 million checks for these sort of nickel type projects. Yeah.
Ollie, have you come up against any of your North American peers and how they perform?
Not overly, but you try to keep across it from an industry perspective. Are they dealing with the same challenges we are? From a permitting and access issue, from a sovereign risk perspective, you try to look at it from a technical perspective. Are they onto something new that we haven't looked at here in Australia? I like to think that we're world leaders in the Australian exploration space. There's no two ways about it, but you're forever learning. I think from a market perspective, and to Ed's point about a potential breakdown before you break through, there's some pretty big macro events on our doorstep at the moment. None bigger than the US election, and I think should you see a shift in government in the US and a shift in policy, we've already started to see it on the world scale. I think you'll see potentially that breakdown and things start to change from a policy perspective, that potentially things become a little bit more streamlined.
Great, thanks. Ed, did you have anything to add?
Nothing on that one. Well, everybody's nearly got served there. Well, lots of people have had their lunch. We've already got a couple of minutes left. Do we have any more questions? Yes, we have, over here. Sorry, I haven't got my glasses on.
You were talking about needing to use new tools to find buried ore deposit. Are these tools you're going to be developing yourselves? Are you relying on universities or the surveys or research organisations like us at CSIRO to develop them for you or work with you to develop them? Or if there are new tools and ideas out there, how is the best way to disseminate them to you so you can use them?
It's very much trial and error, and I think you look at other industries. So first, or other parts within our industry, I look at my first exposure to seismic. Seismic started out and revolutionised oil and gas, and that then got bought across to hard rock, and I saw what it did for Northern Star and a target that they had up at Jundee, and that really opened my eyes to the power of not delineating ore bodies, but identifying structure, and structure is key in nickel deposits. It's key in gold deposits. Now, how do you translate that to a meaningful example in nickel? And there's a bit of trial and error in that. I think the other big sort of buzz at the moment is AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And look, we've dabbled in that from a legend perspective, but I won't mention a name, but a certain individual told me that geologists will be replaced by AI, and I had to explain to him the equation on a napkin at the restaurant of shit in, shit out in terms of data. But it's constantly evolving. You just have to look at things like detection limits from what they were 20, 30 years ago to what they are today. You're doing a reset on a search space because of detection limits alone. So I think you're looking outside industry to see what they're doing in a tech space. You're looking inside industry to see whether they've applied technology that you haven't applied specific to your commodity. So it's all of that combined.
Great, thank you. Great question.
I was just going to say, we're too small to kind of generate ourselves, but I think it's very much a board function to challenge management, to keep learning, the board learning to say, are you looking outside your own bailiwick? So we're very much reliant on externals and reliant on the board to prompt us to keep looking outside.
Great, thank you for the question. We've got time for one more. Did we have any other questions or comments? No, we've done our... Oh, Matt's got one more. He's thought about one more.
Thank you. This is probably more a comment about search spaces and AI. AI works very well in a data-rich environment. Hopefully sufficient data of sufficient quality to filter out the proverbial we discussed earlier. So when one is searching in a place like Kambalda with such rich data history, AI probably has a place to play. But in terms of new field space, search spaces, new frontiers, much less of a role to play because the data richness is not there.
Yeah, I'll make a comment on that. We found, and we're working with some external AI/machine learning guys who are smarter than I've been 1,000 lifetimes. We found in that particular area where we did the seismic, notwithstanding it's surrounded by a heap of data, as you can imagine, because there's no data actually where we did the seismic, it actually doesn't extrapolate and it's not particularly useful. So I found that quite surprising, to be honest.
Great, thanks. Thanks again, Matt. Well, I think we might leave it there. We've given it a good nudge in the last 45 minutes, 55 minutes. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. If you can just join me in thanking our panellists, Caedmon, Oliver and Ed.